You're not family anymore, Evelyn. You were only Michael's mother. Nothing else. My daughter-in-law said those words in front of 23 people during my grandson's birthday dinner. My son didn't defend me. He didn't tell her to stop. He didn't even look surprised. He just lowered his eyes and took another sip of his drink. I stood there for a moment, holding a gift bag wrapped in blue paper, wondering how a woman could spend 71 years building a family only to be told she no longer belonged to it. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply picked up my purse and walked toward the door. What happened afterward changed everything. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes I wonder how many other mothers have sat at a table surrounded by family and still felt completely alone. The birthday dinner had started beautifully, or at least I thought it had. My grandson Ethan was turning 12. He was growing taller every month, his voice beginning to deepen, his smile looking more and more like his grandfather's. I spent 3 weeks searching for the perfect gift. Not something expensive, something meaningful. I finally found an antique baseball signed by a retired Texas Rangers player Ethan admired. The ball had cost more than I should have spent, but seeing his face light up would make it worth every penny. That morning, I stood in my kitchen carefully wrapping the gift. Sunlight streamed through the window above the sink. The same window where my husband Harold used to stand every morning drinking coffee before work. He had been gone for almost 3 years now. Some mornings I still reached for the second coffee mug. Some habits survive grief. Others become grief. By 6 o'clock, I arrived at Michael and Jessica's house. Cars filled the driveway. Laughter drifted through the open windows. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Included. Wanted. Family. Jessica greeted me at the door. Her smile was flawless. Too flawless. The kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Evelyn, she said. Not Mom. Not Grandma. Just Evelyn. I noticed it immediately. I always did. Names matter, especially when someone stops using them. Inside, the dining room buzzed with conversation. Relatives gathered around the large farmhouse table. Neighbors filled folding chairs near the kitchen. Children ran through the hallways. Everyone seemed happy. Everyone except me. Because within minutes, I noticed something strange. No one made room for me. Every chair at the main table was occupied. I stood there awkwardly holding my purse. No one moved. No one offered. Finally, Jessica pointed toward a small folding chair tucked against the wall. Oh, you can sit there. Against the wall. Away from everyone else. Like an afterthought. Like extra furniture. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe I was being sensitive. Maybe grief still made everything hurt more than it should. But then I noticed the photographs. A large display board stood beside the birthday cake. Pictures from vacations. Christmas mornings. Summer barbecues. School graduations. Years of family memories. I slowly walked closer. My stomach tightened. I wasn't in a single picture. Not one. Hundreds of photographs. Hundreds. And somehow I had disappeared from all of them. My hands began to tremble. Surely that wasn't possible. Surely someone would have noticed. Then Ethan opened his gifts. The room erupted with cheers. When he unwrapped the baseball, his eyes widened. Grandma, this is amazing. For the first time that evening, I smiled. A genuine smile. Then Jessica laughed. A short laugh. Sharp. Cold. Well, she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. At least somebody still likes old things. A few people chuckled. Others stared down at their plates. I felt heat creep into my cheeks. Humiliation settled over me like a heavy blanket. Michael remained silent. Again. Always silent. Later, as dessert was served, Jessica stood and tapped her glass. The room quieted. We have some exciting news, she announced. Michael wrapped an arm around her waist. We've decided to move. Applause filled the room. People congratulated them. Jessica beamed. We're starting fresh. Then I asked the question any mother would ask. A simple question. One sentence. Nothing more. Will I still come by on Sundays? The room went silent. The kind of silence that arrives before a storm. Jessica looked directly at me, smiled, and delivered the sentence that shattered whatever remained of my heart. Family visits are for family. A nervous laugh escaped somewhere across the room. Someone coughed. Nobody spoke. Nobody defended me. Nobody said she was wrong. Then she added the words that would echo in my mind all night. You're not family anymore, Evelyn. I turned toward Michael. Waiting. Praying. Begging without words. He wouldn't meet my eyes. And in that moment, I understood something terrifying. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a cruel joke. This had been discussed, planned, agreed upon. I quietly picked up my purse. Nobody stopped me. Nobody followed me. As I reached the front door, I heard a voice behind me. I couldn't see who said it, but I heard every word. Once she's gone, everything becomes much easier. I froze. My hand tightened around the doorknob. Everything. What exactly was everything? And why did it sound like they had been waiting for me to disappear? I walked out into the warm Texas night with that question burning in my mind. I didn't know it yet, but before the week was over, I would discover that being called not family anymore was only the beginning. I drove home that night with the radio turned off. The silence felt easier to tolerate than my thoughts. Dallas traffic moved around me in long streams of headlights and brake lights, but I barely noticed any of it. My mind kept replaying Jessica's words. You're not family anymore. Not family anymore. As if 71 years of living, loving, sacrificing, and raising a son could simply be erased by a sentence spoken over birthday cake. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the neighborhood was quiet. Most of my neighbors had gone to bed. Porch lights glowed softly along the street. Everything looked normal, but nothing felt normal. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house greeted me with the same stillness it had carried ever since Harold died. 3 years. 3 years, and I still expected to hear his footsteps. Still expected to hear the television playing in the den. Still expected to smell coffee brewing before sunrise. Grief changes shape over time. At first, it feels like a storm. Later, it becomes fog. You learn to live inside it. I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for a long moment. The house felt too large for one person. Too quiet. Too empty. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. Harold had bought it on our 25th wedding anniversary. He used to joke that it would outlive both of us. Looks like he was right. I opened the refrigerator. Leftover chicken soup. Half a pie. A container of fruit. I wasn't hungry. I closed the door again. For years, Sunday evenings had belonged to family. Michael would bring Ethan over. We would eat dinner together. Watch football. Argue about barbecue recipes. Laugh. At least that's how it used to be. Over the past 2 years, those Sundays had slowly disappeared. Not all at once. Little by little. Jessica always had a reason. A soccer game. A school event. A neighborhood gathering. A weekend trip. There was always a reason. Now, standing alone in my kitchen, I realized something uncomfortable. The excuses had started long before tonight. Long before the birthday dinner. Long before Jessica openly told me I wasn't family. Maybe she had been saying it for years, just without the words. I walked into the living room and sat in Harold's old recliner. The leather had softened with age. I could almost picture him sitting there, reading the newspaper, complaining about politicians, laughing at his own jokes. The memories felt warm, until I remembered something. 3 months before Harold passed away, he had said something strange. We had been sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. Completely ordinary evening. Then suddenly he looked at me and said, "If anything ever feels wrong after I'm gone, don't ignore it." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief, about loneliness, about learning how to live without him. Now I wasn't so sure. The thought lingered. Uncomfortable. Heavy. I pushed it away and reached for my tablet. Social media had become one of the few ways I kept up with family activities. Photos, school events, birthdays, small moments. I opened the family photo album, or at least I tried to. An error message appeared. Access denied. I frowned. That had never happened before. I tried again. Same message. Then I checked the account settings. My access had been removed. Not by accident. Someone had manually deleted my permissions. I stared at the screen. The room suddenly felt colder. Hundreds of family photographs. Years of memories. Gone. Just like that. My chest tightened. Not because of the pictures. Because of what it meant. Someone wanted me excluded. Deliberately. Carefully. Methodically. I set the tablet down. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed. For one hopeful second, I thought it might be Michael. An apology. An explanation. Anything. Instead, it was my neighbor, Carol. "Everything okay?" she texted. I hesitated, then replied. "Why?" 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Finally, her message arrived. "Oh, I just thought you were moving." I sat upright. "Moving? What are you talking about?" I typed. Her response came almost immediately. "Jessica mentioned it at the community fundraiser last month." My fingers froze above the screen. Last month. A month ago. Jessica had apparently been discussing my future with strangers. And nobody had told me. I called Carol immediately. She sounded surprised. Evelyn, I assumed you knew. Knew what? Jessica said you were considering downsizing. Maybe relocating. Everyone thought the decision had already been made. The conversation ended a few minutes later. But the damage remained. I sat motionless in Harold's recliner, listening to the grandfather clock. Tick, tick, tick. Someone had been planning my future. Without me. The next morning, I woke after only a few hours of sleep. The sun had barely risen. I made coffee, fed the birds outside, watered the flowers Harold had planted years ago. I tried to pretend everything was normal. Then I opened my mailbox. Inside was a single envelope. White. Professional. Official looking. My name wasn't on it. Michael Harper's was. The envelope had been delivered to the wrong address. Or maybe the wrong mailbox. I turned it over. The return address belonged to a law office. In downtown Dallas. My stomach tightened immediately. I recognized the firm's name. Harold had used them years ago. I stood there in the driveway holding the envelope. Morning sunlight warming my hands. A strange feeling settling into my chest. Because suddenly, Jessica's words. The missing photographs. The rumors about me moving. None of it felt random anymore. For the first time, I began to wonder if there was something much bigger happening behind my back. Something that had already been set in motion. And somehow, that envelope felt connected to all of it. I carried it inside, placed it carefully on the kitchen table, and stared at it for nearly 10 minutes. I didn't know it yet, but the answer to why I was no longer considered family was sitting right in front of me. I stared at the envelope for nearly 10 minutes before touching it. The coffee in my mug had gone cold. Outside, the birds continued hopping across the backyard as if nothing in the world had changed. But something had changed. I could feel it. For years, I had trusted my son completely. Even after Harold passed away. Even after family gatherings became less frequent. Even after Jessica slowly positioned herself at the center of every decision. I always believed Michael would never intentionally hurt me. Now I wasn't so sure. The envelope sat in the middle of my kitchen table. Simple. Ordinary. Yet somehow frightening. I turned it over again. The law firm's logo stared back at me. I recognized it immediately. Harold had trusted that firm for decades. They handled property documents, trusts, wills, important things. The kind of things people usually didn't discuss until it was too late. I shouldn't open it. I knew that. The envelope wasn't addressed to me. It belonged to Michael. But another thought kept pushing its way forward. Why was a legal document connected to my son arriving at my address? And why had Jessica spent the last month telling people I was moving when nobody had spoken to me about it? The questions kept piling up. Finally, I picked up the phone and called the law office. After a brief wait, a receptionist answered. I explained what had happened. She asked for the reference number printed on the envelope. A few moments later, she returned. Then she said something unexpected. Oh, Mrs. Harper, that document was copied to several parties. If it arrived at your address, that's actually not an error. I sat up straighter. What do you mean? There was a pause. The woman sounded confused. As far as I can see, your name appears in the file. My heart skipped. My name? Yes, ma'am. The line went silent. Suddenly, the envelope felt much heavier in my hands. The receptionist apologized and explained that she couldn't discuss details over the phone. Privacy rules. Legal restrictions. Then she politely ended the call. I remained seated at the kitchen table long after the conversation ended. My name was in the file. Why? What exactly had Michael and Jessica been working on? An hour later, curiosity overcame caution. I carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several copies of legal correspondence. Most of it was routine. Technical language. Legal references. Pages full of terms only attorneys seemed to understand. Then I found a stapled packet near the back. That was where everything changed. Across the top of one page was a handwritten note. The handwriting belonged to Jessica. I recognized it immediately. I had seen birthday cards, Christmas notes, shopping lists. There was no mistake. The note read, "Convince her gently first." I blinked. Read it again. Then again. Convince her gently first. Not ask. Not discuss. Not involve. Convince. As if a decision had already been made. As if my role was simply accepting whatever they had planned. My stomach tightened. I continued reading. Several pages later, I found another handwritten comment. This one was shorter, colder. Nursing home option remains available. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had misunderstood. I reread the sentence, then read it again. The words never changed. Nursing home option remains available. I felt my hands begin to shake. Not because there was anything wrong with nursing homes. Many people needed them. Many families made that choice with love and care. That wasn't what hurt. What hurt was realizing the discussion had happened without me. My future, my home, my independence. They had been evaluating options as though I were a problem to solve, a responsibility to relocate, a burden to manage. The humiliation hit harder than Jessica's words at Ethan's birthday. Because this wasn't a moment of cruelty. This was planning. Months of planning. Careful planning. I pushed the papers away and stood up. The kitchen suddenly felt too small. I paced across the room, then back again. My eyes eventually landed on a date printed near the bottom of the packet. The date froze me in place. 6 months earlier. I stared at it. 6 months. At that point, Harold had still been alive. Not healthy, but alive. A chill ran through me. The documents had existed while my husband was still here. While he was sitting beside me on the porch. While he was telling me not to ignore anything that felt wrong. My pulse quickened. Had Harold known? Had he seen something? Had he suspected what was happening? The questions came faster now. Too fast. And then I noticed something else. A name. Or rather, part of a name. One section had been blacked out. Someone had intentionally redacted it. Most of the line was unreadable. But not all of it. I could still make out a few letters. Enough to know one thing. There had been another person involved. Someone besides Michael. Someone besides Jessica. A third person had participated in these conversations. A third person had helped make decisions about my life. And whoever it was, they clearly didn't want me to know their identity. I sat back down. The grandfather clock echoed through the house. Tick, tick, tick. Every sound felt louder now. Every memory sharper. Every warning from Harold more significant. For years I had assumed my family was drifting apart naturally. Busy schedules. Modern life. Distance. Now I was beginning to see a different possibility. Maybe I hadn't been drifting away. Maybe I had been pushed. Slowly. Quietly. Deliberately. I gathered the papers and returned them to the envelope. But one thing was certain. I was finished pretending nothing was wrong. Jessica had already made one mistake. She assumed I would never look deeper. The second mistake was even bigger. She assumed I would simply accept whatever future they had chosen for me. As I carried the documents toward the living room, my eyes drifted toward an old photograph hanging above the fireplace. Harold and I, 40 years younger, smiling, happy, unaware of what the future would bring. And for the first time since opening the envelope, I remembered something else. A locked drawer in Harold's study. A drawer he never allowed anyone to touch. Not even Michael. At the time, I thought it contained business records. Old paperwork. Nothing important. Now I wasn't so sure. Because suddenly I couldn't stop wondering whether Harold had left something behind. Something he wanted me to find. Something that might explain why my own family had started planning my future before he was even gone. That night, I couldn't sleep. The envelope sat on my bedside table. The handwritten notes. The nursing home discussion. The date on the documents. Everything kept circling through my mind. Around midnight, I finally got out of bed. The house was dark except for a small lamp in the hallway. I walked slowly toward Harold's old study. The room had barely changed since he passed away. His leather chair still sat beside the window. His reading glasses still rested on the bookshelf. Even now, I couldn't bring myself to move certain things. Some people call that unhealthy. Maybe they're right. But after 46 years of marriage, you don't simply erase someone from a room. You learn to live around their absence. I switched on the desk lamp. Soft yellow light filled the study. My eyes drifted toward the filing cabinet near the wall, then toward the desk, and finally toward the locked drawer I had remembered earlier. For years, I never questioned it. Harold handled most financial matters. Investments, property taxes, business records. I trusted him completely. If he wanted one private drawer, I never saw a reason to ask why. Now I did. I searched the study for nearly 30 minutes. Old folders, desk organizers, storage boxes. Nothing. Then I remembered something. Years ago, Harold kept spare keys inside a small wooden cigar box. The box still sat on the highest shelf of the closet. I climbed onto a chair and reached for it. Inside were old receipts, a watch battery, several faded photographs, and one small brass key. My heart immediately started beating faster. I walked back to the desk, inserted the key, turned it. The lock clicked open. For a moment, I simply stared. Part of me felt guilty. Another part felt terrified. Then I pulled the drawer open. Inside were several folders. Property documents, investment reports, insurance paperwork. Nothing unusual, at least not at first. Then I noticed a sealed envelope underneath everything else. My name was written across the front. Not Evelyn Harper. Not Mrs. Harper. Just Evelyn. Harold's handwriting. I froze. Suddenly, it felt like he was standing in the room, watching, waiting. My fingers trembled as I picked up the envelope. The paper looked old. The edges slightly yellowed. This hadn't been written recently. It had been prepared long before his death. For several seconds, I couldn't bring myself to open it. Then I noticed another line written beneath my name. 6 simple words. Open only if they betray you. I stopped breathing. The room became completely silent. Even the grandfather clock seemed distant. Open only if they betray you. Not if something happens. Not if you're lonely. Not if you miss me. If they betray you. The words sent a chill through my entire body. Because suddenly the documents from the law office didn't feel like a coincidence anymore. Neither did Jessica's comments. Neither did the missing family photographs. Neither did the rumors about me moving away. Slowly, I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several pages long. The first sentence nearly broke me. My dearest Evelyn, if you're reading this, then I was right to worry. I sat down immediately. Tears filled my eyes. Not because I was weak, not because I was frightened, but because after 3 years, hearing Harold's voice again, even through ink on paper, felt overwhelming. I continued reading. Harold wrote about our life together. The day we met. The first apartment we shared. The struggles we survived. The dreams we built. Then the letter changed. The tone became different. More serious. More cautious. And then I reached the paragraph that made my stomach drop. I began noticing changes in Michael after Jessica gained influence over every family decision. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Harold had seen it. Long before I did. He described family gatherings where Michael barely spoke unless Jessica approved. Business discussions where Jessica answered questions directed at him. Financial conversations that suddenly became secretive whenever Harold entered the room. I felt sick. Because I remembered those moments. I remembered dismissing them. Making excuses. Telling myself every marriage changed people. Telling myself it was normal. Maybe Harold had seen the truth while I was still protecting the illusion. I kept reading. Another passage hit even harder. I don't believe Michael is cruel, but I believe he is weak. I stared at those words. Weak. Not evil. Not heartless. Weak. The distinction mattered. Because deep down, I knew Harold was probably right. My son had never been a naturally cruel man. As a boy, he rescued injured birds. As a teenager, he helped elderly neighbors carry groceries. As a young father, he adored Ethan. But somewhere along the way, he stopped making his own decisions. And someone else began making them for him. Jessica. The realization hurt more than anger ever could. Then I reached the final page. Harold's handwriting became noticeably shakier. His health had been failing by then. Yet every word remained clear. If anyone attempts to separate you from your home, your independence, or your dignity, do not surrender. My eyes filled with tears again. I continued reading. There are things I've arranged that they don't know about. I sat upright. My pulse quickened. Things. What things? The next paragraph was shorter. More direct. If that day ever comes, speak with Richard Bennett. I immediately recognized the name. Richard Bennett. Harold's longtime attorney. One of his oldest friends. Someone I hadn't spoken to since the funeral. The letter ended with a final message. Simple. Powerful. Painfully personal. Trust your instincts, Evelyn. You are far stronger than they think. I lowered the pages. The room was completely silent. For a long time, I simply sat there, looking at Harold's handwriting, remembering his voice, remembering his warnings. Then something else occurred to me. A question I should have asked much sooner. If Harold was worried enough to write this letter, if he was worried enough to hide it, if he was worried enough to mention secret arrangements, then what exactly had he discovered before he died? And more importantly, how much of this had Michael known all along? The next morning, I picked up the phone. There was only one person who might have those answers. Richard Bennett. And I had a feeling that conversation was about to change everything. The next morning, I called Richard Bennett at exactly 8 o'clock. I wasn't expecting him to answer personally. Men like Richard usually had assistants for that. But after only 2 rings, I heard his voice. Evelyn. For a moment, neither of us spoke. It had been nearly 3 years since Harold's funeral. 3 years since I'd heard the voice of one of my husband's closest friends. Richard, I finally said. I found the letter. The silence on the other end told me everything. He knew exactly which letter I meant. I was wondering when that day would come, he replied quietly. A chill moved through me. Not because of what he said, because of how calmly he said it. As though this conversation had been waiting for years. As soon as possible, he continued. I think we should meet. 2 hours later, I was sitting inside his office overlooking downtown Dallas. Richard looked older than I remembered. More gray hair, more lines around his eyes. But the sharpness was still there. The same sharpness Harold had trusted for decades. He closed the office door and sat across from me. Then he looked at the envelope containing Harold's letter. You finally needed it. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Richard leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he simply studied me. Then he sighed. Tell me everything. So I did. Jessica's comment at Ethan's birthday. The family photographs. The rumors about me moving. The legal documents. The nursing home notes. The missing access to family accounts. Everything. Richard listened without interrupting. His expression grew darker with every detail. When I finally finished, he folded his hands together. I'm sorry, Evelyn. My stomach tightened. Sorry for what? For being right. The room suddenly felt smaller. What do you mean? Richard stood and walked toward a filing cabinet. After unlocking it, he removed a thick folder. My name was printed on the tab. He carried it back to the desk. Then he opened it. Inside were documents, notes, and records spanning several years. Years. Not months. Years. My pulse quickened. Harold became concerned about 18 months before his death. I stared at him. 18 months. Richard nodded. He started noticing unusual behavior. The same phrase appeared again. Unusual behavior. Exactly what Harold had written. Richard opened one section of the file. At first, it was small things. Family gatherings. Financial discussions. Property questions. Conversations that suddenly stopped when Harold entered a room. I remembered every one of those moments. Back then, they felt insignificant. Now they felt connected. Like puzzle pieces finally clicking together. Then Richard slid a document across the desk. I looked down. The handwriting belonged to Harold. A personal note. One sentence was highlighted. If something happens to me, make sure Evelyn is protected. My throat tightened. Harold hadn't been worried about money. He had been worried about me. Richard continued. He wasn't concerned about strangers. Then who was he concerned about? Richard hesitated. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked uncomfortable. That answer alone terrified me. Finally, he spoke. He was worried about influence. Influence. Not theft. Not violence. Influence. The word lingered between us. He believed someone was slowly isolating you from the family. My chest tightened. I immediately thought of Jessica. The family photographs. The canceled visits. The separate group chats. The comments behind my back. The chair against the wall during Ethan's birthday dinner. One event by itself meant nothing. Together they painted a very different picture. Richard opened another section of the file. Then he handed me a financial report. At first I didn't understand what I was seeing. Then I noticed several highlighted entries. Property evaluations. Home valuations. Projected asset transfers. My house appeared repeatedly throughout the paperwork. I looked up, confused. Why is my house in these reports? Richard's expression hardened. Because someone was studying possible future outcomes. Future outcomes. Such polite words. Such ugly meaning. Someone had been calculating what would happen after I was gone. Or after I was removed. The humiliation hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the numbers. Because my home wasn't just property. It was where Michael took his first steps. Where Harold and I celebrated anniversaries. Where we built our entire life. And somebody had reduced it to an asset on a spreadsheet. Richard watched me carefully. Then he lowered his voice. Evelyn, there's something else. Every time someone said those words lately, my world became worse. I braced myself. What? Harold created a trust. I blinked. A trust. Richard nodded. A very specific one. Suddenly, I remembered the final page of Harold's letter. There are things I've arranged that they don't know about. My heart began beating faster. Richard opened another folder. This one was thinner. Much thinner. Almost secretive. He created it shortly before his diagnosis became serious. I stared at the documents. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because Harold instructed us not to. The answer stunned me. Not even Michael knows the full details. The room fell silent. For the first time since this nightmare began, something shifted. Every discovery until now had made me feel weaker, smaller, more vulnerable. But this was different. For the first time, I realized Harold hadn't simply anticipated betrayal. He had prepared for it. Richard carefully closed the folder. Then he looked directly into my eyes. Evelyn, your husband loved you very much. Tears threatened to surface. I looked away. Richard continued. And he knew exactly what kind of woman you are. I swallowed hard. What kind? A faint smile appeared on his face. The kind who survives. The words stayed with me. Not because they sounded comforting. Because they sounded true. Then Richard reached into the folder one final time. He removed a sealed document, placed it carefully on the desk, and said something that immediately sent a chill through my body. Before we discuss the trust, there's one thing you need to know. I stared at him. What is it? Richard's expression turned completely serious. The person Harold distrusted most wasn't Jessica. My blood ran cold, because there was only one other name that could possibly come next. Michael, my son. The room felt colder after Richard said Michael's name. For a moment, I couldn't process it. My own son. The man I raised. The boy who used to fall asleep on my lap watching baseball games. I shook my head slowly. No, I said quietly. That can't be right. Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he placed the sealed document back on the table and studied me carefully, as if measuring how much truth I could handle. Evelyn, he said finally, I'm not saying he acted alone. That sentence landed harder than the first. Not alone, which meant he was involved. Somehow, some way. Richard leaned forward. Harold noticed something about Michael long before his health declined. I felt my hands go numb. What did he notice? Richard opened another file. This one was different. Personal notes, observations, dates, small details written in Harold's handwriting. Michael started deferring decisions, Richard said. Even simple ones. He would look to Jessica before answering anything. I remembered it instantly. Dinner conversations where Michael paused too long. Phone calls where Jessica interrupted him mid-sentence. Family meetings where Michael stayed silent unless spoken to. At the time, I thought it was respect. Or stress. Now it looked different. It looked like control. Richard slid another page toward me. Harold wrote this 6 months before he passed. I lowered my eyes. The sentence was short, but it cut deep. My son no longer thinks independently. I swallowed hard. My throat felt tight. He said that. I whispered. Richard nodded. But he still believed Michael could be reached. That word stayed with me. Reached. As if my son wasn't lost. Just redirected. Richard stood up and walked to the window. Outside, Dallas traffic moved normally. People living normal lives. Unaware that my entire understanding of my family was collapsing inside this office. There's something you need to understand, Richard said without turning around. I waited. He never accused Michael of cruelty. I exhaled slightly. But, he continued, he did believe Michael was vulnerable. Vulnerable. The same word again. Not evil. Not malicious. Influenced. Controlled. I closed my eyes for a second. Jessica's voice echoed in my memory. You're not family anymore. But maybe she hadn't needed to say it alone. Maybe someone else had already agreed silently. Richard returned to the table and placed a new document in front of me. This one had signatures. My eyes froze when I saw Michael's name. Multiple times. On financial approvals. Property discussions. Legal acknowledgments. I stared at it. He signed this. Richard nodded. Under Jessica's guidance. My chest tightened again. Guidance. Richard didn't soften the word. She controlled the flow of information. He signed what she presented. I felt something shift inside me. Not anger yet. Something heavier. Disappointment mixed with disbelief. Because Michael had always been capable. He wasn't foolish. He wasn't weak-minded. But he was tired. And tired people stop questioning. Richard sat down again. Evelyn, there's more. Of course there was more. There was always more. He opened the final folder. Inside was a recorded transcript. A conversation. Dated 3 months before Harold's death. Between Harold and Michael. Richard didn't play it yet. He just handed me the summary page. The first line made my stomach drop. Harold confronted Michael about changes in family decision-making. I looked up at Richard. He confronted him? Richard nodded slowly. Yes. And Michael didn't deny it. My breath caught. Richard continued. He said, and I quote, "I'm just trying to keep things stable." Stable. That word again. Used too often. Used too easily. Used to justify control. My hands were shaking again. "And Jessica?" I asked quietly. Richard's expression darkened. She was in the background of the call. I felt my stomach twist. Listening. Directing. Silence fell between us. For the first time since I entered this office, I felt something close to fear. Not fear of losing money. Not fear of losing property. Fear of realizing my family structure had already been rewritten without me ever being asked. Richard slid the final page toward me. "This is what changed everything for Harold." I looked down. A single sentence. Written in his handwriting again. "If Michael cannot see clearly, then Evelyn must be protected from both of them." Both. Not just Jessica. Both. My vision blurred slightly. I placed the paper down carefully. Because suddenly, everything made sense in a way I didn't want it to. The isolation. The silence. The missing photographs. The legal documents. The controlled conversations. The careful distancing. It wasn't random. It wasn't sudden. It was gradual, systematic, and deeply intentional. I stood up slowly. My legs felt unsteady. Richard watched me carefully. "What are you going to do?" he asked. I looked at the sealed trust document one last time. Then I answered quietly. "I'm going to find out what my husband already knew before they finish what they started." I left Richard's office with the sealed trust document in my hands. But it didn't feel like I was holding paper anymore. It felt like I was holding the weight of everything my family had hidden from me. The drive home was silent. Dallas looked the same as always. Traffic lights. Busy intersections. People rushing through their lives without knowing that somewhere in this city, a family was quietly breaking apart. When I arrived home, I didn't go inside immediately. I sat in my car for several minutes. The trust document was on the passenger seat. Harold's final protection. Harold's final warning. And maybe, Harold's final truth. My hands trembled slightly as I finally stepped out and walked inside. The house felt different now. Not physically. Emotionally. Every object felt like it had a second meaning. Every silence felt heavier. I placed the document on the kitchen table. And for the first time, I didn't hesitate. I opened it. Inside were structured legal instructions. Clear. Precise. Unmistakable. Harold had created a multi-layered trust system tied to our home, investments, and long-term assets. But what made my breath stop was not the structure. It was the condition. Control of the assets could only be transferred under one rule. I had to be proven mentally and emotionally capable of making independent decisions. My eyes narrowed. That wasn't unusual for a trust. But the next line changed everything. Any attempt to isolate or manipulate Evelyn Harper by immediate family members would trigger automatic legal intervention. I froze. Automatic intervention. Meaning Harold had not just predicted conflict. He had engineered protection against it. My fingers slowly turned the page. There were annotations. Not legal language. Harold's personal notes again. One line stood out. "If Evelyn is ever made to feel she does not belong in her own family, the trust must activate immediately." My throat tightened. He had anticipated Jessica's words. "You're not family anymore." He had built protection around that exact possibility. Then I saw something else. A list of names. Michael Harper. Jessica Harper. And a third name. Richard Bennett. I paused. Richard was involved in the trust structure. That made sense. But then I noticed something unusual. Michael's name had additional conditions attached. Not removal. Not exclusion. Evaluation. Ongoing evaluation. As if Harold had never fully given up on him. As I turned the page again, a final clause appeared. And this time, my entire body went still. If Michael Harper is shown to be under external influence, he must be separated from decision-making authority until clarity is restored. External influence. Jessica. The room suddenly felt too quiet. Harold hadn't just distrusted Jessica. He had identified her role precisely. Then I heard my phone ring. I looked at the screen. Michael. My heart stopped for a second. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Mom." His voice sounded tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just exhausted. For a moment, I said nothing. Then I finally asked the only question that mattered. "Did you know about the trust?" Silence on the line. Too long. Too heavy. Then he answered. "I knew parts of it." My grip tightened on the phone. "Which parts?" Another pause. Then his voice lowered. "Enough to know Dad didn't trust everything I was signing." My chest tightened. Michael, were you aware Jessica was controlling the legal decisions? He didn't answer immediately, and that silence was the answer. Finally, he spoke. I thought I was protecting the family, Mom. The words hit differently. Not denial. Not anger. Just justification. Protecting from what? I asked. His voice cracked slightly. From conflict. From instability. From you two not agreeing. You two. Jessica and me. Not family. Not harmony. Just sides. I closed my eyes. Harold had written it clearly. Influence. Not cruelty. Not malice. Influence. Michael continued quietly. Jessica said things were getting complicated. That decisions needed to be streamlined. Streamlined. A word used to make control sound reasonable. And you believed her? I asked. Silence. Then, I believed it was temporary. That was the most dangerous kind of belief. The kind that delays truth until it's too late. I looked at Harold's trust document again. Everything was already in motion. Everything had already been anticipated. And suddenly I understood something terrifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding between family members. This was a structure. A system. And I was standing at the center of it. Michael spoke again, quieter now. Mom, are you okay? I almost laughed. Because that was the question. After everything. After exclusion. After manipulation. After legal control. He still asked if I was okay. But not if I was family. I looked out the kitchen window. The same backyard where Harold used to sit. And I finally answered. I don't know anymore. And for the first time, neither did my son. I didn't sleep that night. Not after Michael's call. Not after hearing the hesitation in his voice. Not after realizing that even now, the truth between us still felt unfinished. The next morning, I asked Richard to arrange one final meeting. Not in his office. Not in a courtroom. But at home. My home. The place Harold had built everything around. By noon, they arrived. Michael first. Jessica right behind him. And for the first time in weeks, they were both standing in my kitchen without control, without distance, without carefully constructed narratives. Just truth waiting to surface. Jessica broke the silence immediately. I don't know what game this is, Evelyn, but it needs to stop. Her voice was sharp, confident, still certain she was in control. Michael didn't speak at first. He just looked tired, worn down in a way I hadn't noticed before. I placed the trust document on the table. No drama, no warning, just truth. This isn't a game, I said quietly. This is what Harold left behind. Jessica's eyes dropped to the papers. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her expression. She reached for them immediately. Richard stopped her. These are legal documents. You don't have authority here. Her hand froze. That moment alone changed the energy in the room. Michael stepped forward slowly. Mom, what is this? I looked at him. Really looked at him. Not as a son I remembered, but as a man shaped by years I hadn't fully seen. This is your father's trust, I said. His face tightened. I knew parts of it, he admitted quietly. Jessica turned sharply toward him. You what? His voice cracked slightly. He told me there were protections. I just didn't think it applied like this. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Unavoidable. I opened the document again. My fingers were steady now. Strangely steady. There's something you both need to understand, I said. Jessica scoffed. Here we go. But I didn't react. Not anymore. I turned the page and pointed at the clause. Any attempt to isolate me from my family would trigger intervention. Her expression changed instantly. Not fear. Not guilt. Calculation. Michael looked away. And in that moment, I understood something painful. He wasn't surprised. He was confronted. I continued. Harold didn't just see what was happening, I said. He documented it. Every step. Jessica tried to regain control. This is manipulation. You're being influenced by who? I interrupted calmly. The room went silent. Jessica didn't answer. Because there was no answer that would make her look innocent anymore. I turned to Michael. Did you ever stop to think why your father was so specific about influence? He lowered his eyes. No. That honesty hurt more than denial. I took a breath. Then I said the words I never thought I would say to my own son. You weren't removed from this family, Michael. You stepped away from it. His head snapped up. Mom. But I didn't let him interrupt. I don't blame you for being influenced, I continued. But I do blame you for never questioning it. Jessica finally lost control. Enough, she snapped. This is about money. It always has been. Richard stepped forward. No, he said firmly. It's about control. And Harold made sure control could never be taken without accountability. Jessica's face tightened. For the first time, she looked cornered. Not powerful. Cornered. Michael turned slightly toward her. Jessica, did you know about all of this? A long pause. Too long. Then she said something that changed everything. I made decisions for the good of this family. Not denial. Not explanation. Just justification. And that was the moment everything collapsed. Michael exhaled slowly, like something inside him had finally cracked open. I didn't see it, he whispered. I really didn't see it. I stepped closer. Not angrily. Not emotionally. Just truthfully. You saw enough, I said. But you stopped looking further. Silence. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Richard placed the final document on the table. The trust is now active, he said. Jessica's head snapped up. What does that mean? Richard answered simply. It means Evelyn retains full control of all assets and decisions unless she chooses otherwise. For the first time, Jessica had nothing to say. No argument. No manipulation. No angle. Just silence. I looked at both of them, my son, and the woman who had tried to define my place in my own family. Then I said the only thing that mattered anymore. I don't want revenge. Jessica looked confused. Michael stayed silent. I just want truth to stay truth, I continued. No more rewriting it. I turned to Michael. I will not cut you out of my life. His eyes widened slightly. But you will no longer make decisions about it without understanding them. He nodded slowly. Not relieved. Not victorious. Just aware. Jessica grabbed her purse. This is ridiculous, she muttered. But her voice lacked strength now. She walked toward the door, then paused. For a second, I thought she might say something else. But she didn't. She left. And for the first time in months, the house felt quiet in a different way. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Just still. Michael remained standing in the kitchen. Unsure. Lost. I finally spoke again. You don't have to fix everything today, I said. He nodded slightly. I don't know how to fix any of it, he admitted. I looked at him. And for the first time in a long time, I saw not a version of my son shaped by influence, but the boy I once raised underneath it all. You start by seeing clearly, I said. He exhaled. Slowly, like he had been holding his breath for years. Outside, the Texas sun was bright. Unchanging. As if nothing in the world had shifted. But everything inside this house had. Later that evening, after they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table. Harold's trust documents in front of me. His handwriting still echoing in my mind. You are stronger than they think. For the first time, I believed him completely. Not because I had won anything, but because I had finally stopped disappearing. And somewhere in that silence, I understood something simple. Family is not who claims you. It is who stands with you when truth is hard to face. And now, I finally knew where I stood.